درود بر شما. من صدیق اسماعیلی هستم. همراه با همکارانم در خدمت شما هستیم برای تقدیم برنامه نگاه 2. با شروع بحران سرمایه‌داری در سال 2008 ناکارآمدی اقتصاد بازار آزاد برای برنامه‌ریزان کشورهای توسعه یافته سرمایه‌داری هم آشکار شد. سران دولت‌ها به ویژه در کشورهای غربی که بدیلی نداشتند تا به اون متوسل بشن، دو راه حل موقت رو در دستور کار گذاشتند. اول اینکه دادن چندین هزار میلیارد دلار به صاحبان بانک‌ها و مؤسسات بزرگ مالی و اقتصادی و دوم اینکه حمله به سطح معیشت و شرایط کاری صدها میلیون کارگر زن و مرد در دنیا. کارگران با آکسیون‌های توده‌ای بسیار به مقابله با دولت‌ها برخاستند و پیشروان کارگری به دنبال یافتن پاسخ این سوال رفتند که چرا چنین شد؟ میلیون‌ها نفر از آنها به مطالعه آثار اقتصادی مارکس و به ویژه شاهکار او یعنی کتاب سرمایه روی آوردند تا بلکه پاسخ پرسش خود رو پیدا کنند. این آموزگار پرولتاریای بین‌المللی در 150 سال پیش این بحران و بحران‌های مشابه اون رو پیش بینی کرده و به همین دلیل کارگران و پیشروان کارگری برای پاسخ سوالات خود سراغ مارکس رفتند. ما اکنون در دوره‌ای هستیم که توده کارگر هنوز نتونسته بر اساس آموزه‌های مارکس کل سیستم سرمایه‌داری رو زیر سوال ببرند، اما نابرابری نجومی حاصل از اون رو آماج حملات خود قرار دادند. برای پیمودن فاصله بین هدف قرار دادن نابرابری تا حملات به خود مالکیت بورژوایی و شناسایی بدیل سوسیالیستی در مقابل اون به تلاش و مبارزه مستمر، فداکارانه و خستگی ناپذیر نیاز است. مطالعه و درک آثار خود مارکس بخشی از این تلاش‌ها خواهد بود. در میان آثار مارکس کتاب کاپیتال جایگاه ویژه‌ای داره. ما برای کمک به بینندگان تصمیم گرفتیم کلاس‌های درس دیوید هاروی رو ترجمه و پخش کنیم. دیوید هاروی یکی از برجسته‌ترین استادان مارکسیست دانشگاهی در روزگار ماست که مدت 40 سال از کاپیتال رو تدریس میکنه. ما تاکید میکنیم که پس از شنیدن بحث‌های دیوید لازمه بینندگان علاقه‌مند خود کاپیتال رو با دقت و حوصله مطالعه کنند. ما تلاشمون اینه که سهمی کوچک رو برای فهم آموزه‌های مارکس ایفا کنیم. هر گونه ملاحظات و پیشنهاد شما عزیزان قطعاً ما رو در بهبود برنامه کمک خواهد کرد. عده‌ای از بینندگان این برنامه پیشنهاد کردند که به جای زیرنویس کل کلاس‌های آموزشی رو صداگذاری کنیم. عده دیگر پیشنهاد دادند که تکست‌ها رو خوانا و فیلم رو کند کنیم تا بیننده قادر به خوندن زیرنویس‌ها باشه. ما تصمیم گرفتیم که کل کلاس‌ها رو با زیرنویس اما به طوری که به راحتی قابل خوندن باشه ارائه دهیم. البته فیلم رو هم کند کرده ایم که از این لحاظ بیننده به راحتی بتونه تکست‌ها رو بخونه. سپس همین کلاس‌ها رو صداگذاری و یا به اصطلاح دوبلاژ و اون رو نیز پخش خواهیم کرد. لطفاً با ما تماس بگیرید و نظرات و پیشنهادات خود رو با آدرس ایمیلی که در صفحه تلویزیون می‌بینید برای ما ارسال کنید. برنامه نگاه رو میتونید از طریق سایت تلویزیون حزب کمونیست ایران ببینید و همچنین میتونید از طریق شبکه فیسبوک با آدرسی که از صفحه تلویزیون مشاهده میکنید قابل دسترس و اون رو تعقیب کنید. با ما همراه باشید.
Well, you're in for a treat today. We're going to be talking with David Harvey on the lectures that he's given now for almost 40 years, I think, on Capital. My name's Neil Smith. I teach in anthropology and geography at the City University of New York. And David's been a colleague of mine since he came here. But before that, a long time before that, more than 30 years, I was a student of David's at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And that's where I first became not aware of Capital as a book, but that's where I first read through it and did so indeed with David. David, what inspired you to start to want to read Capital back, presumably in the very early 1970s?
It was one of those historical moments where it seemed right to do it. I arrived from England, fresh off the boat in the summer of '69. I arrived into a city, Baltimore, where in 1968 there had been tremendous eruption of violence in the city in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King. The civil rights questions in the city were blatant. The racism in the city was blatant. The Vietnam War was on, and all the war protests were hotting up. And it was a very, very confused time. And I remember in, I think, December of '69, Fred Hampton got assassinated in Chicago, Black Panther leader. And shortly after that, in May '70, there were the killings at Kent State. Huge student strike, millions of students all over the country just went on strike. And then after that, there were killings at Jackson State. So this was a very, very, very upset time. And I think, for me anyway, there was also a sense that we didn't quite know how to handle, or how to explain this. And I'd been sort of trained or as a sort of social scientist thinking about things, and I couldn't find a framework that would really encompass all that was going on. So I said to a few graduate students, hey, why don't we just read Capital? Since it's a book we haven't read, maybe there's something in there that would work. And so a few of us sat down and we ran on a reading group on it, and that's how it all began. And then, having done it once and completely misunderstood the book, completely misunderstood it. Now I look back and I'd be embarrassed to listen to what we were saying about this book in the first, it was the blind leading the blind through this enormous text, and we didn't know what we were doing. And then we thought, well, we've done it once, we better do it again, because we obviously haven't got this quite right. But one thing I did learn at that point from that was you only really begin to understand Capital when you get to the end. It's very hard to start off with it, sort of clear kind of understanding. So the second year we decided we'd have another go at it, and we had another go at it. And then I thought to myself, well, this is interesting now. I began to see a framework emerging that could help me explain what was going on. So I thought, well, I should keep at it. And there were people around like me who kind of felt they needed a framework. And so step by step, I started to say, well, I'll do this every year. And of course, one of the things that happens when you do that is that you suddenly find yourself called a Marxist. I had no idea what a Marxist was, and I really didn't, care too much initially, but suddenly, just because you're reading the book and taking it seriously, and you want to know more about how to understand the world through these lenses, you suddenly find yourself in this political corner, and after a bit you say, oh, well, I guess if that's who I am, then that's who I am, so. Right.
Well, I think it might be useful if, since the lectures are coming, if you gave us a bit of an overview, a bit of a discussion of what you think are the high points of the chapters in Volume 1 of Capital.
One of the things that I think is really good to do, and one of the reasons I've got a great deal of pleasure out of teaching this course this way, is that many people have taken courses where they've done a little bit of Marx, a little bit of Weber, Durkheim, this kind of stuff. They've read excerpts from Marx or something like that, but they've never actually read it as a book. And it is a fantastic literary construction. So one of the things that I really want to highlight is what a good read it is. Once you get past the difficulties of the language and grappling with all these kind of concepts and so on, it's a really, really dynamic piece. It flows very well. And it flows from the beginning point, which is just about a simple idea of a commodity. You go into a supermarket, you find a commodity, you buy the commodity, you take it home, you eat it or wear it or whatever. And just beginning with that thing which we all know about, it takes you step by step by step, it's right the way through, unraveling how a capitalist economy works. And then it builds around that sort of insights, stunning insights as to why we have unemployment, or why there is a struggle over time. Why is it that capitalists are always trying to snatch time away from you? Why do we live a life where our world is kind of orchestrated around a certain kind of concept of temporality, and what the oppressions are which exist with all of that? So I think it's incredibly revelatory in what it does. So the aim of this course is to get you to read this book. And to do it as well as you can in Marx's own terms, which may sound a bit ridiculous because since you haven't read the book, you won't know exactly what his terms are. But one of his terms is that you read. And therefore, you'll get a lot more out of this class if you read the assigned readings before you come to class than if you just come along and listen. And there's another reason for that, which is that you have to struggle always with understanding something. And in struggling with it yourself, you can come to your own understanding of what Marx stands for and what it means to you. So it's an engagement between you and this book, you and this text, that I want to encourage. In doing that, however, there is a complication which arises from the fact that it's very hard to approach this without some preconceived ideas. Everybody has heard of Karl Marx. Everybody knows the term Marxism and Marxist, and there are all kinds of connotations that go with those words. So what I have to ask you at the beginning is to try to lay aside a lot of those preconceptions, a lot of those things you think you know about Marx, and just try to read the text to find out what it really was he was trying to say. And that, of course, is not easy for a bunch of other reasons, which I want to talk about by way of introduction. One of the other preconceptions with which we tend to approach a text of this kind is out of our particular kind of intellectual history and our own particular intellectual formation. And for people who are graduate students, for example, this intellectual formation is very often governed by disciplinary apparatuses, disciplinary considerations, disciplinary concerns. And so the tendency is to sort of read it from your disciplinary standpoint. Well, one of the great things about Marx is he would never have got tenure in any discipline. And if you want to read him right, then you've got to forget about getting tenure in your discipline. Not in the long run, of course, but at least for the purposes of this course. You have to think about what it is that he is saying, independent of the disciplinary apparatus with which you start to think about things. Now, the other reason for saying that is actually this turns out to be an astonishingly rich book in terms of its references. References to Shakespeare, to the Greeks, to Balzac, references to all of the political economists, to philosophers, to anthropologists and all the rest of it. In other words, Marx draws upon an immense array of sources. And as he does so, it might be really exciting for you to kind of figure out what some of those sources are. And actually some of them are quite hard to track down, and I've been looking at this for a long time. But it really is kind of very exciting when you start to see some of the connections. For instance, when I first started reading this, I had not read many of Balzac's novels. Then I'm reading Balzac's novels, and then I say to myself, oh, that's where Marx got it from. And then you kind of suddenly see all the ways in which he's drawing upon a whole experiential world, full of Goethe, full of Shakespeare, you know, all the rest of it. So it's a very rich text in that kind of way, and you start to appreciate it, I think, more if you stop saying to yourself, well, who is he referring to in history, or which economist is he talking about, and so on. And the other thing that will come across if you read it that way is you will actually find it's a very interesting book. It's a fascinating book. And here, of course, we come across another set of preconceptions, because many of you will have encountered some of Marx in your reading. Maybe you read the Communist Manifesto in high school. Maybe you went through one of those wonderful courses which is called Introduction to Social Theory, when you spent 2 weeks on Marx, 2 weeks on Weber, a few weeks on Durkheim, and all the other kind of characters. And maybe you read some excerpts from Capital. But reading excerpts from Capital is entirely different from reading it as a book, because you start to see these bits and pieces that are excerpts as somehow or other playing into a much grander and broader narrative. And what I think I would like you to really try to get out of this is some sense of what that grander narrative is and what that grander conception is, because that is, if you like, how Marx, I think, would want to be read. He would hate it if somebody said, hey, you've got to excerpt this chapter, or you've got to do this chapter, and you can understand Marx that way. And he would certainly hate it if he knew he was being given 3 weeks in an introduction to social theory class. And I think you should hate that too, because you get a certain conception of Marx from that, which is radically different from the kind of conception you get from reading a book like Marx's Capital. Now, the other thing that happens, of course, from the disciplinary standpoint is that very often people start to reorchestrate their understandings around that disciplinary standpoint. That is, you say, well, I'm not a good economist, I don't get the economics in here at all, so I'm not going to be bothered to follow the economic argument, I'm just going to follow the philosophical argument. And actually, it's very interesting reading Marx from that perspective. Now, I've taught this course now every year since 1971, except one. Some years I've taught it twice, some years I even taught it 3 times. And in the early years, I used to teach it to all kinds of different groups. One year it was the whole philosophy department from what was called Morgan State College at the time, Morgan State University. Another time it was all the graduate students in the English program at Johns Hopkins. Another year it was economists and this kind of thing. And actually what was fascinating to me was each time you read it with a different group, they saw different things in it. And actually I learned a great deal about the text from going through it with these very different disciplinary groups. Sometimes it drove me crazy, but I learned a great deal. One year, for example, I ran it with a group of people from the comparative literature program at Johns Hopkins, about 7 of them. And we got on to chapter 1, and we spent the whole semester on chapter 1. It drove me nuts. I was saying, look, we've got to get on to the working day, you know, and things like that, very important issues of this kind. And they'd say, no, 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 we've got to get this right, we've got to get this right. You know, what does he actually mean by value? What is actually this money commodity? What is fetish about? What is this really all about? And it turned out that, and I said, well, why are you doing all of this? And they said, well, they're working very much in the tradition of somebody I'd never heard of at the time and thought was obviously an idiot because he was producing this kind of thing. It was a man called Jacques Derrida, who spent a lot of time at Hopkins during the late 1960s, early 1970s, and so actually was very influential in the comparative literature program. Now, one of the things I actually afterwards thought about this was what they taught me was to pay very careful attention to Marx's language. What he says and how he says it and what he means and what he's missing out. And that is also terribly important. And so actually I learned, and I'm very grateful to that group now, apart from the fact that I no longer sound myself like an idiot for saying I had never heard of Jacques Derrida, you know. So it was just very influential to have a group of that kind sort of take me through just chapter 1 with a fine-tooth comb, going through almost every word, every sentence, every connection with the sentences and so on. Yes, indeed, I want to get you to the working day. Yes, indeed, I want to get you through the volume, so we're not going to spend all the time on chapter 1. But this is the kind of thing that different disciplinary perspectives can open up. Because Marx actually wrote this text from those many different standpoints that I've indicated. And I think that we have to recognize how those different standpoints intersect within the text. Now, there in fact are 3 major areas of inspiration for this work. And they're all powered forward by a deep commitment on Marx's case, to critical theory, to a critical analysis. When he was relatively young, he wrote a little piece to one of his sort of editorial colleagues at a German journal. And the title of the piece is "For a Ruthless Criticism of Everything Existing." A very modest piece, and I suggest that you actually go read it, because it's fascinating. What he does there is he doesn't say everybody is stupid, I'm going to trash everybody, I'm going to criticize everybody out of existence. No, what he says is there are a lot of serious people who've really thought about the world very hard. And they've seen certain things about the world, and what they have seen is our resource. What the critical method does is to take what they have seen and to work on it and to transform it into something different. And one of the things he later said, which I think captures his method admirably, is he says the way in which you do that transformation is you take radically different conceptual blocks and you rub them together and you make revolutionary fire. And that is in effect what he's doing. He's taking very, very different traditions, pushing them together, rubbing them together, and creating a completely new framework of knowledge. And as he says in one of his introductory prefaces or so on, he says, well, if you're trying to create a new system of knowledge, then you've got to reshape the whole conceptual apparatus. You've got to reshape the whole method of inquiry. Now, the three conceptual blocks that he rubs together in Capital are really these. First, there is the conceptual block of political economy. 18th century, early 19th century political economy. This is mainly English, not solely English, but it's from Locke and Hobbes and Hume to, of course, Adam Smith and Ricardo and Malthus and a host of other figures like Stewart and minor figures. And he subjected all of these people to a deep, deep criticism in 3 volumes called Theories of Surplus Value. He didn't have a photocopying machine and he didn't have the web and all those kinds of things, so he laboriously copied it up by hand, long passages from Adam Smith, and then wrote a commentary on them. Long passages from Stewart, again, long sort of commentaries on them. In fact, what he was doing there was what we now call deconstruction. And one of the things I learned from going through Theories of Surplus Value was how to deconstruct arguments this way. And in fact, what he does is to say, Adam Smith makes this argument. What is he missing out? What is the absence? What is the missing piece in this that really helps pin it all together and when we put it in there, transforms the argument? So political economy is really quite strong as one of the pieces in the story. Now, I know political economy pretty well. I've read a lot of that stuff and I feel fairly familiar with it, and maybe it's because I come out of the English tradition and all the rest of it that I feel fairly comfortable with it, and so when we're going through, I'll give you quite a bit of the materials coming out of that in terms of where Marx is getting his inspiration from, because he doesn't always cite it in Capital. An idea comes up which is clearly taken from one place and is very significant, but Marx doesn't always cite it. There are, of course, also some other theorists, even in the United States, but primarily French. So there was a French tradition of political economy too, rather different. So Marx makes reference to that. But that is one, if you like, one of the big areas of his discussion. The second area is German classical critical philosophy, which stretches back to the Greeks. Now, Marx wrote his dissertation on Epicurus, so he was very, very familiar with Greek thought. And of course, the way in which Greek thought came into the German philosophical critical tradition, Spinoza, Leibniz, and of course Hegel, and many others, that kind of tradition is also extremely significant. And so in many ways he's using German critical philosophical tradition in relationship to political economy. He's putting them together. And he also drew heavily, in lots of ways, upon Kant. So that tradition is also very significant. I'm not very familiar with that tradition. I'm not deeply trained in that tradition. So those of you who have a deeper training in that tradition than I do will probably spot things that I'm going to miss. This is one of the things I learned when I worked with a group of philosophers who were steeped in Hegel and all that kind of stuff, so I got a very Hegelian kind of view of how Marx is proceeding. I know some of it, but I'm not so strong on it as I would want to be. And I had to say, early on, I had some sympathy with the British economist Joan Robinson when she said she really objected to the way in which Hegel was putting his nose in between her and Ricardo in Marx's work. I had a very sympathy with that. And so some of the problems I have with sort of becoming familiar with Hegel, I have some sympathy with. In fact, I jokingly say, and I probably shouldn't say it and I'll upset all the Hegelians around, actually one of the best things about reading Hegel before you read Marx is it makes reading Marx pretty easy. So get yourself a dose of Hegel before you do Marx and then everything will be okay. The third tradition that he uses and appeals to a lot is the utopian socialist tradition. Now this is primarily French, although there's Robert Owen and some of the British, and of course Thomas More in the British tradition, who crops up every now and again in the text. But the big socialist thinkers, there was this tremendous burst of utopian thinking in the 1830s and 1840s in France. People like Etienne Cabet, who created the group called the Icarians that came here and settled in the United States after 1848. Proudhon, Saint-Simon, Fourier. Marx was very, very familiar. He spent some time in Paris, very familiar with their works. And if you read the Communist Manifesto, you find that he's a bit frustrated with their works. He doesn't like the way in which the utopians are actually configuring some ideal society over there without any idea of how to get from here to there. For Marx, what he wants to do is to try to convert the socialist project from a utopian socialist project into a scientific socialist project. But in order to do that, he just can't take English empiricism, English political economy, those kinds of things. He has to recreate, reconfigure what scientific method is all about. And his scientific method is therefore predicated very much on this interrogation of, if you like, the mainly English tradition of classical political economy with the mainly German tradition of critical philosophy, with, if you like, the utopian impulse, asking what is communism, what is a socialist society, how can we critique capitalism, as, if you like, the third strain which is impelling him forward. Now, I'm pretty familiar with the French socialist tradition, particularly of that period, and the utopian tradition of that period, and have even written about it. So I've read a lot of those people like Fourier, Saint-Simon, and Proudhon in particular, and I think actually what happens is that Marx often draws from them more than he wants to acknowledge. Since he'd kind of wanted to distance himself from that overt utopian tradition that was there in the 1830s and 1840s, and which he in many ways saw as part of the chronic failure of the revolution of 1848 in Paris. Since he wanted to distance himself from all of that, what he did was to say, okay, I'm not going to acknowledge them very much at all, but in fact he makes a great deal of use, particularly of Saint-Simon, but also by negation, Fourier. In fact, a lot of his ideas are kind of the negative of Fourier. But so you can't really understand him without understanding who he's negating, and he's negating Fourier in the same way that he negates several of the political economists kind of outright, particularly Malthus, who he had a particularly hard time accepting. So those are, if you like, some of the main threads that come together in this book. I suggested, however, that we should be reading it in Marx's own terms, but that also poses a whole set of difficulties. And Marx himself was aware of this.
He interestingly commented in one of his prefaces, and particularly the preface to the French edition, when there was a suggestion that the French edition should be brought out as a serial, you know, and the French like to publish things as feuilletons. That's sort of a paper comes out and it's the first 2 chapters, then another next week, you know, sort of a serialized kind of publication. And what Marx writes, this is in 1872, says, "I applaud your idea of publishing the translation of Capital as a serial. In this form, the book will be more accessible to the working class, a consideration which to me outweighs everything else." That is the good side of your suggestion. But here is the reverse of the medal. The method of analysis which I have employed, and which had not previously been applied to economic subjects, makes the reading of the first chapters rather arduous. And it is to be feared that the French public, that will include you, always impatient to come to a conclusion, eager to know the connection between general principles and the immediate questions that have aroused their passions, may be disheartened because they will be unable to move on at once. That is a disadvantage I am powerless to overcome, unless it be by forewarning and forearming those readers who zealously seek the truth. There is no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits. So since you are all here zealously concerned to pursue the truth, I have to warn you that, indeed, the reading of the first few chapters is particularly arduous, it's particularly difficult. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is his method, which we'll talk about in a minute. The other reason has to do with the particular way in which he's setting up his project. His project is to understand how a capitalist mode of production works. And he has in mind that this is going to be a huge, huge project. In order to get that project underway, he has to develop a conceptual apparatus which is going to help him understand all of the complexity that exists under capitalism. And again, in one of his introductions, he talks about how he's going to go about that. He says, the method of presentation, and we're now dealing with the method of presentation. And this is in the postface to the second edition. The method of presentation must differ in form from that of inquiry. The latter, that is the process of inquiry, has to appropriate the material in detail to analyze its different forms of development and to track down their inner connection. Only after this work has been done can the real movement be appropriately presented. If this is done successfully, if the life of the subject matter, that is the capitalist mode of production, is now reflected back in the ideas, then it may appear as if we have before us an a priori construction. What Marx is talking about here is his method of inquiry is different from his method of presentation. His method of inquiry starts with everything that exists, everything that's going on. You start with reality as you experience it, as you see it, as you feel it. You start with all of that. You start with descriptions of the reality by the political economists, by novelists, by everybody. You start with all that material. And then you search in that material for some simple concept. This is what he calls the method of descent. The method of descent from the reality which you find going down, looking for some foundational, fundamental concepts. And once you've uncovered and discovered those fundamental concepts, you then come back to the surface. And you look at what's going on around in the surface, and you see that behind the world of appearance that you started out with, there is another way to interpret what's going on. In effect, Marx is a pioneer in a method which, if you're familiar with psychoanalysis, you would also, I think, understand. That you start with surface behaviors, and you see also, and you look for conceptual apparatus like Freud did. You come up with a conceptual apparatus, and then it brings you back, and you can explain, that person is acting that way, and it looks like this, but in fact it's a representation of that. Marx is doing the same sort of thing. In fact, Marx is pioneering this method in social science. Start with the surface appearance, find the deep concepts. In Capital, he's going to start with the deep concepts. He's going to start with the conclusions of his inquiries. What are my basic concepts? And he lays these basic concepts out very simply, very directly, and indeed it looks like an a priori construction. When you first read it, you say, where is all this stuff coming from? Where did he get it from? Why is he doing that? And half the time you have no idea what he's talking about with these concepts. But then bit by bit, as you move on, you start to see how these concepts are illuminating things going on around us. So after a while you start to say, so that's what value theory really means. That's what the value argument is all about. That is what this fetish is really all about. That is what these concepts are doing for me. But in effect, you only understand how these concepts work by the time you get to the end of the book. Now that's a very unfamiliar strategy. I mean, we're familiar with strategies where people hammer into you, get the concept straight, and then you go on to the next one. It's like you build brick by brick by brick by brick. Marx is more like, dissecting an onion. I use this metaphor, it's an unfortunate one, because as somebody pointed out, when you dissect an onion, it usually reduces you to tears. But what he does in effect is to start from the outside of the onion, go to the center of the onion, find out what makes the onion grow, and then come back to the surface. So you only understand at the end of the day what he's about when he comes back to the surface. And his argument about what makes it grow, and when you start from the inner and you work outwards in these sort of layers, and that's what you do, you perpetually enrich the concepts. Something that seems like a very stark and very abstract concept gradually gets richer and richer and richer as you go on. It's an expansion of these concepts. It's not a brick-by-brick approach at all, and most of us are not used to that. So one of the things you've got to get used to is that this is what's going on. And what that means for you is you've got to hang on like crazy through the first 3 chapters at least, because you probably not really get the sense of what it's all about very well until you get further on down into the text, and then you start to see how these concepts are working and and then, if you like, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, that by the time you start to actually derive some of the consequences that Marx lays out, then, of course, you get somewhere. And included in this is his choice of starting point. As you will see, he starts with the standpoint from the concept of the commodity. Now, this is a very strange starting point. I mean, most of you, when you think of Marx, will think of phrases like, all history is a history of class struggle. So So you think, well, capital should start with class struggle. I don't know, it takes to about page 300 before you get to any class struggle in Capital. Very frustrating for those of you who kind of really want to get in there and think about the class struggle. Why doesn't he start with money? Actually, in his early preparatory investigations, he wanted to start with money. But then he found it was more and more impossible to start with money. Why didn't he start with labor? You know, he could have started all kinds of different places, but he decides to start with the commodity. And if you go back and you read his preparatory writings, you see there was a long period, about 20 or 30 years, where he was struggling with the question, what's the best starting point to really go after this? What's at the center of this onion, if you want to call it that? When I analyze it, really allows me to understand how the whole thing works. And he decided to start with the commodity. It's an arbitrary starting point. You don't get its logic, he doesn't explain it, he doesn't even bother to try and persuade you about it. He just says, this is where I start, this is how I start to think about it, these are the concepts I'm going to use. Very cryptic kind of beginning to the whole thing, doesn't attempt any kind of persuasion at all.